Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar Greenhouse Gas Emission Estimator, Concept and Utilization from US Department of Transportation. Before we begin, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Hananto Prakoso, as Transportation Attaché at the Embassy of Indonesia in Washington, D.C., and it is my honor to be your moderator for today's webinar. In Jakarta, as a capital of Indonesia and its agglomeration, it is recorded that the number of movement or the number of trips has reached 88 million per day by 2020. And it is evident that this number keeps rocketing every year. This is partly due to the attractiveness of the Greater Jakarta to the working age group, making this agglomeration area a magnet for migrants. This great number demands for sure to be accommodated. The majority prefers using private vehicles and leads the share of public transportation or users in low level. However, in the last 5 years, public transportation development has become priority in transportation infrastructure development in Indonesia. The first MRT, mass rapid transportation in Jakarta, has started operating since 2019. In the near future, Greater Jakarta will have 2 lines of LRT, light rail transit, from the eastern part of Jakarta to the central area. And also the second line is from southern part to the central Jakarta. Moreover, BRT, bus rapid transit, we call it Transjakarta, keeps developing in terms of route network and also integration system. This massive public transportation development is expected to meet 60% of trips using public transportation by 2030, which is mentioned in the Greater Jakarta Transportation Master Plan. One important indicator which is still needed to be evaluated and calculated is about the impact of those public transport infrastructure to the greenhouse gas reduction in Greater Jakarta and also in Indonesia as a whole. This indicator is a big homework for all transport stakeholders in Greater Jakarta area, both for central and also local government. That's why today, the knowledge sharing from United States Department of Transportation regarding greenhouse gas emission estimator, concept and utilization is necessary. This is a good opportunity for us, for Indonesia stakeholder, to learn and understand how the estimator utilized in United States. This webinar is organized by Center for Sustainable Transportation Management, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia, collaborated with FTA, Federal Transit Administration, and also for Volpe Center, United States Department of Transportation. And also, this webinar is attended by Ministry of Transportation officials, as well as other related stakeholders in Indonesia. And now we would like to welcome the Director of Center for Sustainable Transportation, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia, Bapak Marwanto Heru Santoso. Good evening, Mr. Heru. Thank you for joining us. And I would like to welcome Director Office of Environmental Program, Federal Transit Administration, US DOT, United States Department of Transportation, Ms. Megan Blum. Good morning, Ms. Blum. Thank you for your coming.
Good morning. Yes, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Blum. Nice to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you. And I should say good evening to you.
And then Environmental Protection Specialist, Office of Environmental Program, Federal Transit Administration, US DOT, Mr. Sadat Khan. Good morning, Mr. Khan. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam. Sadat Khan. Assalamualaikum. Good morning.
Waalaikumsalam.
And of course, our extraordinary speakers, I would like to welcome Mr. Carson Pu from Volpe Center, United States Department of Transportation. Good morning, Mr. Pu. Thank you for your coming.
Good morning, Mr. Pu. Nice to meet you, Mr. Pu.
Good evening. Thanks for having us.
And then I would like to welcome Ms. Gina Filosa from Volpe Center, US DOT. Thank you for your coming, Ms. Filosa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Good morning, Ms. Filosa.
We would like to express gratitude for all making the time attending this webinar. We hope everyone in a good health, and I think you should be proud of this webinar because right now this webinar is attended by close to 200 participants. Bravo for everyone. Thank you. Okay, for the first time, to mark the beginning of our event, we will witness together the opening remark from the Director of Center for Sustainable Transportation Management. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Marwanto Heru Santoso. Mr. Heru, time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Hananto. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning in Washington DC.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Good evening in Jakarta. Distinguished speakers, Miss Megan Blum, Director for the Federal Transit Administration, Office of Environmental Program FTA, Mr. Sadat Khan, Assalamualaikum, Environmental Protection Specialist, Office of Environmental Program FTA, Mr. Carson Pu, Transportation Industry Analyst, US Dutch Pulp Center, Ms. Gina Filosa, Transport Analyst, US Pulp Center. Distinguished moderator, Mr. Hananto, my friend, Transportation Attaché Indonesian Embassy, Washington, D.C. And also distinguished government officer from Minister of Transportation, Minister of Environment and Forestry, local government officer from ladies and gentlemen. Transportation of Republic Indonesia. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all at this international webinar on the topic of greenhouse gas emission, GHG Estimator, concept and utilization. Thank you for being in this virtual event. I would also express my sincere appreciation to the Minister of Transportation and Secretary General that gives direction for the Center of Sustainable Transport Development to hold international webinar this evening. In this webinar, our primary agenda is sharing knowledge from the U.S. Department of Transportation expert on the concept and utilization of the GHG estimator, of which implementation is focused on mass transit. As part of its recognition of Earth Day, Federal Transit Administration FTA has released an updated transit greenhouse gas emission GHG estimator. Based on inventory of the Ministry of Environmental and Forestry of the Republic of Indonesia, Indonesia's greenhouse gas emissions show fluctuation and trend of increase fluctuation and tend to increase every year from 2000 to 2018. And in 2019, it was recorded that Indonesia's emissions represented 1.89% of total global emission, Global Change Data Lab. Accordingly, Indonesia is currently accelerating the development of public transportation infrastructure, include bus rapid transit (BRT), mass rapid transit (MRT), and light rail transit (LRT), especially in agglomeration cities that have high demand to make the entire transportation system more efficiency, environmentally friendly, and fully connected. This development is expected to the result of shifting user from private vehicle to public transportation, as well as reducing emission and air pollution. To measuring the success of the program, one of which the emission reduction is a measurement tool is needed. The current obstacle is that Indonesia has not yet had a detailed guidance on calculating emission from the public transport sector. Based on the information obtained, U.S. Department of Transportation has developed the greenhouse gas estimator application, and through this webinar, they are pleased to share the concept and its utilization. Moreover, to support the emission reduction program as Indonesia's nationally determined contribution, NDC, committed at the 2009 United Nations Climate Change Conference, that is the reduce its GHG emission by 26% with its own effort, and by 41% with international assistance by 2030. The Minister of Transportation and other stakeholders in Indonesia need to learn the application from the U.S. Department of Transportation as a reference for calculating public transport sector emission and monitoring progress, as well as measuring the achievement of the NDC target. Hopefully, this webinar will add to our insight and understanding of greenhouse gas emission estimators so that we can implement this application in Indonesia in the near future. Ladies and gentlemen, I am firmly convinced that your active participation and valuable contribution will provide substantial outcome toward our effort in improving the air quality. Thank you for bringing your energy, knowledge, and expertise. I wish you all fruitful webinar. Thank you. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Heru, for the opening remark. Please give virtual applause to Mr. Heru, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. The second opening remark will be given by Ms. Megan Blum, Director, Office of Environmental Programs of Federal Transit Administration from United States Department of Transportation. Ms. Blum, you may begin.
Okay, thank you, Hanato. So good morning to everybody attending. I just wanted to say or good evening to everyone attending. Yes, I just wanted to say a quick thank you, and thank you especially to Hanato at the Indonesian Embassy in DC for reaching out to Federal Transit Administration earlier this year about our transit greenhouse gas estimator tool, and for helping to organize this knowledge session. Also, I'd like to thank the Ministry of Transport and particularly the Center for Sustainable Transport Management for your interest in learning more about our work on this particular tool, and we look forward to sharing our work with you today and answering any questions you may have. As we go through the presentation, we'll give some more background and then walk you through a demonstration. So I'll save the details for our presentation coming up. But thank you again.
Thank you very much, Megan. Please give virtual applause to Megan. I know that we are looking forward to our next part of our webinar or knowledge sharing session, the presentation from extraordinary speakers from Volvo Center, United States Department of Transportation. They will provide us with insight about the greenhouse gas emission estimator concept and utilization. And also right after, of course, we will have a Q&A session before the end of our knowledge sharing session. To ask questions, please put your question to the Q&A box with the particular format. Type your name, space, and your question. I repeat, to ask question, please put your question to Q&A box with the particular format. Type your name, space, and type your questions. Without further ado, on behalf of the organizing committee, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our knowledge sharing session webinar, a dedication from Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. The presentation will be given by Mr. Carson Poe and Ms. Gina Filosa. Mr. Poe is a transportation industry analyst at the U.S. Department of Transportation's Volvo Center. His area of interest and expertise include climate change mitigation, sustainable uses of transportation right-of-way, and also pipeline emergency response. Mr. Poe holds a master's degree in energy and environmental analysis from Boston University, and also a bachelor degree in interdisciplinary studies or environmental policy and planning from Appalachian State University, while Ms. Filosa is a policy analyst at the US DOT Fulvey Center. Her work focuses on climate change mitigation, environmental policy, and also program evaluation. Gina holds a master's degree in urban and environmental policy and planning from Tufts University, and also bachelor degree in environmental studies from Providence College. Okay, once again, good morning, Carson and Gina.
Thank you, Hananto. I'm going to share my
Carson
screen
and
now. Is that
Gina,
okay?
screen is yours.
Okay. All right, Hananto, can you confirm that you can see that's the screen?
Yes, you can see it clearly.
Great. Thank you so much. But I'll say one thing before we get started. Our colleague Sadat Khan is also going to give a few of the slides early on. So Sadat, I apologize that we didn't have your short bio. Maybe you can give a few words, but just so you know where Gina Filosa and I fit in, Megan, of course, is the director of FDA's Office of Environmental Programs, as she mentioned. Sadat works under Megan's office, and then the Volpe Center is a complementary agency to FTA within the U.S. Department of Transportation. And Gina and I work on the Estimator under Sadat and Megan's direction. Sorry, just having one technical difficulty here. Okay. All right, Sadat, I'll hand it to you and we can get started.
Thank you, Carson, and hopefully everyone can hear me.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Like Carson mentioned, my name is Sadat Khan. I work in the Office of Environmental Planning at FTA. I'm an environmental protection specialist. And we wanted to, before we dive deep into the FTA's green gas emission tool, or Estimator for short we call it, we thought it would be helpful to provide you some background information on what led to the development of the tool. I'll stop the video just to make sure that I'm concentrating on the slides and to remove the distraction. National Environmental Policy Act of 1969 was one of the first most comprehensive law ever written that establishes the broad national framework for protecting the environment in the United States. NEPA's basic policy is to ensure that all branches of the US government consider the environmental impact prior to undertaking any major federal action that significantly affects the environment. NEPA requires federal agencies to analyze and disclose environmental effects of their proposed action in order to make informed decisions. NEPA also established Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ for short, an executive office of the president to issue NEPA procedures and regulation. Next slide, please. NEPA is a broad environmental law and requires considering various environmental specific resources via laws, regulations, executive orders under the NEPA umbrella, which can be seen here. In red font, you see two examples of single environmental specific requirement concerning air quality or climate change. That would be Clean Air Act and Executive Order 13990. NEPA is interdisciplinary approach where community planner, transportation planner, environmental planner, engineers, and all the stakeholders work together to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the environmental impact of the proposed action. Next slide, please. So in August 2016, Council on Environmental Quality, CEQ, the agency responsible for implementing NEPA release final greenhouse gas emission guidance, the GHG guidance provides a framework for federal agencies on how to consider the impact of their action on global climate change in the NEPA review. The guidance stated that when addressing climate change in NEPA, agencies should consider the potential effect of the proposed action on climate change, as indicated by assessing GHG emission, and the effects of climate change on proposed action and its environmental impacts. Next slide, please. As stated in the previous slide, the 2016 guidance required the consideration of the GHG emission from proposed action, which is our focus today with the estimator. With that, I'll pass it to Carson, who will walk us through the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sadat. So an essential part of NEPA and the regulations that implement it is a rule of reason. That rule of reason allows agencies to determine, based on their experience and expertise, how to consider an environmental effect and prepare an analysis based on the information that's available. The usefulness of that information to the decision-making process and to the public, and to the extent that the anticipated environmental consequences, those things are all important factors to consider when applying that rule of reason. The CEQ guidance on greenhouse gases that Sadat just mentioned, it acknowledged that being able to incorporate greenhouse gas emissions analysis by reference in environmental documents would probably be a valuable approach for practitioners, both considering the effects of greenhouse gas emissions from a proposed action, as well as the implications of climate change on those proposed actions. At the time, back in 2016, FTA was interested in exploring whether assessing the effects of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change for transit projects at the programmatic level would be a practical approach for transit agencies. And by programmatic here, we mean at a broad program-wide level. And so FTA put together a team and we evaluated when individual project level analysis might be recommended versus when simply referring to a programmatic assessment might be recommended. The programmatic assessment, it was intended to be a reference for transit agencies, especially those that were preparing environmental documents for projects where that detailed project level greenhouse gas analysis would provide information just a little more beyond what we had already collected and considered in the programmatic assessment. In other words, referring to the programmatic assessment can save a transit agency time when conducting the NEPA analyses that they'd be working on as part of their overall NEPA documentation. FTA understood that a transit agency might still want to or need to move forward with the project-specific analysis, and it was that led FTA to start developing the Transit Greenhouse Gas Emissions Estimator, and I'm just going to call it the Estimator from now on. As you may know, the Estimator is a Microsoft Excel-based spreadsheet tool that allows a user to estimate partial life cycle greenhouse gas emissions that are generated from the construction, operation, and maintenance phases of a transit project across select transit modes. We say partial life cycle emissions here because there are some emission sources that the estimator doesn't currently address. For example, the manufacture or disposal or recycling of transit vehicles. So what did we do? We think the underlying concept and calculation is straightforward, and we made it that way on purpose. First, we wanted to give users the ability to include as many greenhouse gas emission sources related to a transit project as they had data for. That meant trying to incorporate into the estimator a way for users to estimate greenhouse gas emissions from the transitway and station construction components of the project, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions from maintaining that transitway and maintaining the transit vehicles. And then, of course, we needed to factor the operations of the transit vehicles and the associated facilities. We wanted users to be able to account also for the greenhouse gas emissions that a transit project was expected to displace. In other words, to subtract the greenhouse gas emissions of the automobile vehicle miles traveled avoided due to the anticipated transit ridership. By adding greenhouse gas emissions from construction, maintenance, operations, and then subtracting those displaced emissions, we thought that you could estimate annual greenhouse gas emissions from the proposed project. The team, we did an extensive literature review to understand the state of the practice in quantifying transit greenhouse gas emissions. We also used that literature review to identify and assess what tools and emissions factors were already available for each of the components of this calculation. And so let's talk about each of those individually. First, there are the greenhouse gas emissions related to construction. In the estimator, construction includes transitway and stations, as I mentioned, whether that be at grade, below grade, or elevated track for the rail modes, or the roadway for bus modes. It also includes the embedded GHGs from the overhead catenaries, if there are catenaries for the project, and for parking facilities. You'll notice that this slide says amortized. We decided to give users the flexibility to amortize or spread out the construction-related emissions over a time horizon that they choose. The estimator will show both total emissions over that analysis period, as well as the annual emissions over that period. The main data sources here that we used were from the Federal Highway Administration. They have a tool that they developed called the Infrastructure Carbon Estimator, or ICE, and some peer-reviewed research by Hansen et al. FHWA's ICE tool is another spreadsheet tool for estimating life cycle emissions from the construction of transportation facilities as well as their maintenance. And it's based on information from a nationwide database of construction bid documents, data collected from state DOTs, and consultation with engineers and life cycle analysis experts. The Hansen research looked at emissions associated with materials used in constructing commuter rail lines. For the maintenance component of the calculation, the estimator includes greenhouse gas emissions factors for the maintenance of the track, if it's a rail project, or the lane miles, if it's a roadway project, bus rapid transit, as well as the transit vehicles, both of which are from FHWA's ICE tool. For maintenance of the transitway, ICE, and by extension, our estimator, accounts for the direct emissions associated with the routine maintenance activities of that transitway, such as vegetation management, for example, among other activities. For roads, that might be pavement, repaving the road. For transit vehicle maintenance, and here that includes the standard upkeep and inspection, cleaning, replacing the flooring of the vehicles. We also use ICE's, FHWA's ICE tool, as well as for routine track maintenance. There's also some research by a professor at Arizona State University, Mikhail Chester. We used some of his work for the greenhouse gas emissions factors for 40-foot buses and for rail vehicle maintenance. His work was looking at the emissions associated with maintenance of various California rail systems. For the operations piece, we considered the upstream emissions related to extracting, producing, and transporting vehicle fuels, and the downstream tailpipe emissions that result when the vehicles are operating. We derived emissions factors for road-based vehicles, including buses, from Argonne National Laboratory's greenhouse gas regulated emissions and energy use in transportation model. That's a mouthful. It's GREET for short. They release it roughly every year and a half. And so we used a 2020 release for our most recent update for our tool. For the rail modes, we calculated emissions factors using data on electricity consumption and transit vehicle miles traveled that is collected in FTA's National Transit Database, as well as electricity emissions rates that are in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's, it's called the Emissions Generation Resource Integrated Database, another mouthful. For short, that's EPA's eGrid. We also accounted for the greenhouse gas emissions related to operating rail and bus stations and maintenance and storage facilities. Those emissions factors were based on annual electricity and heating usage data that 7 transit agencies shared with us for a variety of their facilities. So we took that data that the transit agencies gave us and aggregated them and estimated the annual electricity and heating fuel usage per square foot by facility type. We didn't have cubic footage information for those facilities to calculate that in a different way. So that's maybe a place that we can improve in the future. And then finally, the estimator allows users to account for the emissions that transit projects might displace due to the ridership effect. That we use that term to refer to the shifting of trips away from personal vehicles to the transit mode. This is a metric that at least American transit agencies typically have to forecast when applying for federal funding. We also included a carbon sequestration component that we can show when Gina does the demonstration, but essentially it allows a user to factor the annual per tree carbon sequestration lost due to tree removal if a tree or trees is removed for the project, or gained if trees are planted. And those factors were based on some U.S. Department of Agriculture research that estimates the carbon sequestration potential of an urban tree, a variety of species in the U.S. based on various American cities. Now, before we do the demonstration, there's a couple important things that I'd like you to keep in mind. First, for the most part, we relied on previous work and vetted sources, either federal government in the US or from academia. I touched on those just now. They're up on the screen. We've documented them in great detail in a user guide that accompanies the estimator. It's also important to note that we set out to create a user-friendly tool that eliminated barriers for transit agency staff. And what I mean is some of the existing estimators, such as GREET or ICE, are fairly technical, if not very technical. And we thought that may deter some people from using those tools, especially when a tool like GREET sort of speaks to the entire transportation enterprise and not just parts that may be involved with the transit project. Although our estimator lacks the precision for projections that you may be able to attain by using one of the more complex emissions models or a route-specific ridership estimate, we think it can generate early informative greenhouse gas emissions estimates for a broad range of transit projects. And with the NEPA context that Sadat that introduced you to, we think it is adequate there. And then one other important note, electricity generation is the dominant industrial source of air emissions in the US today. The US EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, puts together that eGrid database I mentioned. It's a comprehensive source of data on the environmental characteristics of almost all electricity generated in the US. It gives us an emissions profile for every grid-connected power plant in the US and includes values such as pounds, or you could convert to kilograms, of emissions per megawatt hour of electricity generated, and that allows for the direct comparison of environmental attributes of electricity generation from region to region to region. The estimator also relies on these specific emissions factors, region-specific emissions factors, for any transit-related greenhouse gas source that involves electricity. And that ranges from power for the rail system, if it's a rail project, to electricity for a hybrid electric vehicle, if that's the type of vehicle a user says is being displaced from the project. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, Gina, and let you share. Just 1 second.
So I think
All right.
you're still, oh wait, there you go.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Can everyone see the tool?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so as Carson said, I'm going to give a demonstration of how to use the tool. So just to orient everyone to the tool itself. So as Carson said, it's an Excel-based tool that is made up of several different worksheets here. So the first worksheet that opens up to is just some general instructions about the tool. The main screen, or the main component of the tool, is this screen, or this worksheet titled Ghg Calculator. So from this screen, you'll start entering your inputs, and then the user will be able to connect to each of these other input screens I'll talk about momentarily. And on this main screen, this is also where you'll calculate and view the results. So these next 4 worksheets are where the user will enter inputs for the different phases. So there's a worksheet for construction, one for facility operations, vehicle operations maintenance, and then the displaced emissions. And then these next 3 worksheets comprise the back end of the tool. So these 3 worksheets are usually hidden from the user. So this is not something that they would usually see, but this is where the calculations all take place and where all the emission factors by mode and phase and source are all stored. So to do the actual demonstration, I go back to this main screen. So again, this is where the user will start to enter their inputs. So I'm going to run through 2 projects. First is going to be a light rail project. So the first step, you'll have to enter the location of your project. So in this case, what state your project is located in. So I'm going to pick Colorado for this example. And then the user has an option of entering their analysis period. So for whatever time length they want to analyze the project, whether that be just for 1 year or over the life of the project. So the tool will generate emissions on an annual basis as well over whatever lifetime or analysis period the person enters here. So for this example, I'll just choose 30 years. Okay, so next, then you're going to go through and put your inputs in for each of these phases. And so to enter the constructions inputs, you'll click on this and it'll bring you to this construction screen. The inputs here ask for parking, number of trees removed, and then you'll enter information on the tracker or mileage and stations. So for this example, I'll walk through, there's 2,025 parking spaces in a garage, and then 75 surface parking spaces. And there will need to be 10 trees removed to construct this line. In this next step, you'll select the transit mode. So again, the option from this drop-down menu, it gives the options available. So we'll choose light rail for this example. And then you'll enter your mileage of track, and you'll indicate what portion is underground, elevated, or at grade. So for this project, there's a 1/2 mile elevated and then 5 miles at grade. And this entire project we'll assume is electrified. So there's 5.5 miles of catenary. And then we will have 3 at grade stations. So again, for the stations, indicate how many of those are underground, elevated versus at grade. So once you enter all your construction's emissions, you will return to the calculator. And so I should say there, you can build in, if you wanted to be looking at several different types of projects at once, you can enter additional projects on the next line. But for this one, we'll just enter this one streetcar line. So then we'll return to that main page. And then you'll see here the inputs that you just entered for the construction phase will appear in this screen, so you can see what you've entered. And then we'll go down to enter the facility operations information. So this is any stations or maintenance facilities that will be constructed as part of the project. So for this light rail project, we said it had 3 stations. And so the total square footage of those stations is 2,000 square feet. And we'll also say that this light rail project is going to need a maintenance facility, or we'll have a maintenance facility constructed as part of it. And that maintenance facility will be 9,000 square feet. So again, once you've entered all your inputs, you'll return to the calculator. And again, the inputs you just entered will show, be summarized here on this portion. Then you can move down to the vehicle operations and maintenance inputs. So this is where you'll enter the amount of VMT that your new project will have. So again, we'll choose light rail, and it forces that will be an electric, run on electricity. So as Carson pointed out, you'll have to indicate which e-grid region you operate in, so it matches the emission factors. So again, this project was located in Colorado, so that is associated with this e-grid region RMPA. So you'll choose that from the drop-down menu. And then enter in the annual transit VMT that new project is anticipated to have. So in this case, it's 662,700 VMT. Okay, and then once you enter that, you'll return to the calculator. And the next and final screen is for the displaced VMT. So again, that's the amount of VMT your new project will displace. So in this case, this project, we're going to say it's going to replace a bus line that is currently operating on diesel, and it's going to displace 48,000 VMT of bus travel, as well as for just personal vehicles that are assumed to all run on gas, it is going to displace about 27 million vehicle miles travel each year. So once that's entered, you go back to the calculator. So now all our inputs are entered. You again summarized all on this screen here. If you need to change anything, you would just go back to that screen and change whatever's needed. And then once all your inputs are in there, you'll press calculate results. And those results will show up here. So the summary results in the screen show you the greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis and over the total analysis period that you selected. So in this case, it was that 30-year period. And then it provides more detailed results for both annual and over the lifetime or the analysis period selected. So it shows how much, what or amount of emissions by each phase, and whether those emissions are from upstream materials, transport, or those are downstream, so tailpipe emissions. So for this project we just entered, we see that over on an annual basis, the project, because it's displacing so much personal VMT, that the project is overall displacing 6,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent each year, and over the 30-year period, about 193,000 metric tons. Okay, so that's one example for the light rail, and then I'll just quickly run through another example using a bus rapid transit just to show another example. So when you want to enter something new, there's a clear all input screen that will erase everything you just entered. And it takes a minute to do that. Okay, so now it's clear again. So I'll just quickly run through the second example. So this time we'll just pick a different state. We'll choose Tennessee. We'll do again a 30-year analysis period. So for this bus rapid transit project, we will assume that there's only 20 surface spots that will be built. There will not be any trees removed. So we'll choose BRT from our drop-down screen. For this, it's all at grade. There's 7 miles of new BRT and 17 new stations. Oops, sorry, this should be entered here. And this, so this is for, oh no, yes. So this is going to be here in this new converted alignment. So once your construction, you'll go back to enter facility. For this BRT, there's not any construction. The bus stations are just, they don't require any electricity. There's no heater or lighting, so there's no facility operations associated with that. So we'll leave this screen blank. So then we'll go to vehicle operations, and again, choose our BRT. We will assume that this BRT is running on a hybrid diesel, and then we'll enter. And so because it's not electricity, we will not have to choose an e-grid region for this particular project. So then we'll enter the VMT, and we'll assume this new project will have 325,000 VMT per year. Go back to the main screen and then enter our displaced. And so this project, we anticipate displacing personal vehicles at a rate of 750,000 VMT per year. Okay, so that's all the inputs for this project. So you can double check here your inputs to make sure they're all correct, and then go to the results and click on this. So for this particular project, which shows that the annual emissions are a net positive of 2,611 metric tons per year, and over the analysis period, about 78,000. And so I think the difference between this project and the light rail project that I showed, even though the light rail project had much more construction emissions associated with it, it also had a much higher rate of displaced emissions. And this one has a lower rate of displaced emissions, so it's not offsetting the emissions that are generated by the project itself. So those are just 2 quick examples of how to use the tool. So I will stop sharing and pass it back to you, Carson.
Thanks, Shannon. So could this be adapted for Indonesia? We think so. And we had been emailing with Hananto earlier this year about that, and probably some of you on this. We do have some caveats or some things that you might consider if you were to try to create a tool like this or adapt it for Indonesia. Things that we think that you would need to know are items like the emissions rate of electricity production in Indonesia. I quickly looked and saw that there are some national. I don't know if you have an equivalent to something like the eGrid that breaks it up across, regionally. But that does allow you to give some specificity if you do have that information. You would need to know characteristics of the material sourcing, and by what I mean there is that ICE tool that we mentioned from the Federal Highway Administration relied on some research into the materials, the construction materials for rail and roadway projects, and so they did a lot of that legwork for us, and we're just relying on their work. It's possible that the sourcing of construction materials in Indonesia is less carbon intensive. It may be more carbon intensive, but we think that may be one thing that you would need to look at to make this transferable. Also, along those same lines, we're not familiar with the fleet characteristics, both the transit fleet as well as personal vehicle fleet, and so it may or may the emissions factors for vehicles that we use for this estimator may or may not be applicable for you all. I suspect I mentioned that the GREET tool that gives us the emissions rates for basically all of the personal vehicles. I suspect the fleet is similar, but you all would need to look at that and confirm. And then facility energy use. This is actually something that we think we can improve ourselves, but that would certainly be something that someone looking to adapt this for their context would need to look at. And so from here for us, we're planning on looking at asking users that have either used the tool or wanted to use the tool what they would like to see, how they'd like us to change it, what is intuitive and worked for them, and maybe what hasn't worked for them, and then use that input to create a new and improved version later this year. And with that, Renato, that concludes our presentation, and we're happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, and please give virtual applause to Carson and Gina. Thank you for your excellent presentations. From Carson and Gina's presentation, we know that there is a long story and effort until the Ghg estimator born. In the point of view of agency or government, an aggregate analysis of Ghg emission or climate change effect will be more useful and efficient instead of detailed analysis or complex model. There is also opportunity to modify this estimator for Indonesian need or Indonesian case by adjusting new assumption or variable or other Indonesian characteristic, which was already mentioned by Carson in the last presentations. Thank you once again, Carson and Gina. So in this panelist, we have also the Director of Public Communication and Information Bureau. Good evening, Mr. Junaidi. Thank you for your coming. So after listening to all speakers' presentation from Carson and Gina, now it is the time for other participants to be involved because we are entering the Q&A sessions. And on behalf of the organizing committee, we apologize in advance if your question cannot be read because the amount of the questions against our time limit. And now I would like to read the question that came in and has been curated by the organizing committee. Committee, please, could you open the question from our attendee, from our participants? Question one from Mr. Made Sukmayasa. Land Transportation Polytechnic in Bali, Bali Island. Question 1. I would like to ask how long it took for the United States Department of Transportation or Federal Transit Administration to prepare the data source for each component to create the transit greenhouse gas emission estimator. Here, it is informed that the transit greenhouse gas emission estimator is complementary to the programmatic assessment. This means that it is not an obligation, but it can be an additional value for the program. I wonder, will it be mandatory in the future? Carson and Gina, please, you may answer the question.
Thank you for the question. In terms of how long it took for FTA and Volpe to prepare the data source, I would say that for us to work on this project, it was probably, we released the estimator and the programmatic assessment in 2016. It probably took a year and a half, if I remember correctly, maybe 2 years. But most of that work was actually working on the programmatic assessment part, not the estimator. The estimator, we actually did really quickly, I think, and we were able to do that because the data sources, as I mentioned, people had already done that work for us. We just had to go out and find it. And so I said extensive literature review. I realized that we often say extensive literature review, but this truly was where we were trying to see what was out there, what existed, what could we use to build this the estimator around. And as part of that, you know, it wasn't just a desk exercise for us. We actually called and coordinated and talked with some of the researchers to understand their work better and to make sure that we weren't misusing or mischaracterizing their work. You are correct. It is complementary to the programmatic assessment. As I mentioned, the programmatic assessment we think would be something that a transit agency could refer to if they didn't want to do that project-specific look. When we got toward the end of finishing the programmatic assessment, we thought we had some time left over, so we said, hey, if we made a tool that could focus on project-specific characteristics, would that make sense? Would that be helpful? And the answer was yes, and so that's why we did this. Whether it will be mandatory in the future, I'm not sure. I couldn't say. I don't know. Probably not, but I don't know.
Thank you, Carson. Now we are moving to the next questions. The question number 2 from Mr. Fadli Adriansa from Human Resources Agency, MOT, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. The question is, this estimator developed since 2016 and updated in 2021 to include more current emission data and make it more user-friendly, which means that the basic principle of these two estimator versions is still the same. I have read in user manual introduction, which explained that this estimator precision is not absolutely accurate if compared with more complex emission model, but it can generate early information for broad range of transit project. Based on 5 years experience using this estimator in previous version, how much of this estimator accuracy when compared to using more complex model and tools? Carson and Gina, please.
It's a great question. Thank you. Everything is correct. It took us, we updated the tool once since 2016. We're planning to do it again. The basic principles of the two estimator versions was the same. We may be adding some elements to the next version that expand the scope a little bit. And yes, as I mentioned, and the user manual says, our tool may not give you the precision of other more complex models. I would just clarify that there are some models that allow a user to get very specific in terms of here's the route, here's the ridership, here's the transit-oriented development that we think may sprout up along that route, and get very detailed. We theoretically could add those pieces to our estimator, but again, we were trying to err on the side of something that you could pick up, and this week do an estimate and not need to do a deep dive on sort of translating what you were looking at with a more complex tool. The result that you get from our tool, if we've done it correctly, it would be the same result that you would get from using the other tool. It's just our tool doesn't allow you to add more and more inputs, if that makes sense. In other words, if you take the 5 or 6 inputs that you can use for our tool and use them on a more complex, it should use the same result get the same result because we're using the same data.
Thank you, Carson. Now we move to the next question, question number 3 from Mr. Rohmat, Land Transportation Training Agency, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. Question number 3, the calculation of transit Ghg emission estimator version 2 uses data from the United States Environmental Protection Agency in the form of annual total output emission rate. If it is to be implemented in Indonesia, should Indonesia use manual total output emission rate? Carson?
Thanks for the question. I would not want to suggest what Indonesia, what position you should take or what policy you should make on what to use. I will say for us, we left that decision up to the user. Gina didn't show this, but when she picked Colorado and she picked Tennessee, and then selected the emissions rates for those regions, we also left the option in there for a user to pick it's called the US mix. And basically it's an average across the entire US. And when I did a quick search for Indonesia, I did see that there is at least a nationwide Indonesia mix. So I wouldn't tell you what to do, but I'll let you know that we have given users the option to either use the US mix or a region-specific emissions rate.
Thank you. Now we move to question number 4 from Mr. Hendra. Mr. Hendra is from Jakarta Transportation Agency. The question is, allow me to ask question about Ghg estimator, specifically to measure the impact of electric bus to Ghg. Currently in Jakarta, we have a pilot project of electric bus implementation, around 100 fleet of e-bus being planned to be implemented in Transjakarta BRT system. So we have a BRT system in Jakarta, we call it Transjakarta. We need some alternative or method how to measure Ghg reductions. Perhaps the easiest method, and it can be accepted for any stakeholders. Do you have any idea about it, Carson or Gina?
So I guess my immediate reaction is this question asks, we need some alternative method. I don't know that I know how you're measuring greenhouse gas reductions now. I will say that the question of electrification is something, especially of buses, is something that we are also considering. And that I mentioned a few minutes ago that we're looking for ways to improve our estimator, and that may be one that we focus on with our next update, is giving a user the option to figure out what converting a fleet from say a diesel or a CNG fleet to electric fleet, what impacts that would have in terms of greenhouse gas reductions. I don't know if that's a great answer to your question. I'll ask our team if there's anybody else that wants to add to that. Otherwise, I think that's as good as I can do for now.
Yeah, and I would just point out that you could, and we've talked about, for our use of that, answering that question, you could use the tool as it currently is to look at what running the BRT on the current fuel source would be, and then running a second run of the tool using what the electricity source would be and then comparing those two results. So you could use the tool in that way for now.
Thank you, Gina and Carson. Please, committee, we can move to next question. Yeah, question number 5 from Mr. Helmi, Greater Jakarta Transportation Authority. According to the Ghg estimator, especially at the displaced emission input screen, should we have to choose or leave it blank if the new transit project, like new BRT route, only replace the fleet with higher Euro or US tire standard for diesel engine with the same fuel sources? Do you have any idea, Carson and Gina?
If I understand the question correctly, I think I'm reading this to say, if a bus rapid transit project, or any transit project for that matter, is displacing very efficient vehicles, should they leave that blank in the estimator? I mean, I would say that's a user choice if I'm understanding it correctly. Yes, we have thought about the implications of a state, for example, like California, where personal vehicles, there is a greater penetration of hybrid and electric vehicles in California. And so theoretically, a transit project could replace those trips in what we would call clean vehicles. If a user were to put that information in our estimator, it does account for an electric vehicle or a hybrid vehicle displacement. And so what that's going to result in is just a smaller positive impact of the transit project, if that makes sense. So as electricity gets cleaner, the transit project is going to get cleaner, but the same is the case for vehicles. As the vehicles get cleaner, the GHGs offset from transit are also going to get smaller.
And I would just say, I am interpreting this question a tiny bit differently. I'm interpreting as they're asking that if you're replacing it, the servers with the same fuel source, so there's no improvement, which may correct not be the right interpretation, but if that is the case, I would say if it's a 1-for-1, if you're exchanging a one BRT route for a new upgraded one, but it's the same fuel source, then you would not, I would say, put in any displaced emissions because it's a 1-for-1. You're not really displacing anything. You're just replacing mileage.
Thank you,
So
Carson and Gina.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Question number 6 from Mr. Tangguh Wicaksono from Research Development Agency, MOT, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. Does the formula need the modification or justification since the characteristic of each country totally different, for example, tropical climate and so on? It was already mentioned by you, but you can repeat your answer.
Yeah,
Please, Gina or Carson.
I think our team would say the calculation, the formula itself doesn't need to be changed, but some of the factors probably would need to be changed, especially for electricity.
Thank you, Carson. We still have many questions from the participants. Now, question number 7 from Miss Dina, not Gina, Dina with D. Miss Dina, Center for Sustainable Transportation Management, Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. Based on the information, the Ghg estimator tool has recently been published. Is there any regulation in FTA that regulate the use of these tools as one of the requirements for submitting infrastructure development planning document? If there is a regulation, does it also regulate the periodic reporting mechanism for filling in these Ghg tools from the regional level to the central level? And then can you tell me more about the experience of coordinating monitoring, reporting, and verification with relevant stakeholders such as for example, in Indonesia, Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Energy? This is Indonesian case. Do you have any idea, Carson or Gina?
Thank you for the question. So the use of the tool and the programmatic assessment are both voluntary. There's no requirement to. We think it may be helpful for some, but there is no requirement to. There is a requirement if you go back to what Sadat was presenting on, to consider the effects of climate change from a project and on a project in NEPA. And we think that this can help transit agencies do that analysis. I don't know specifically about how you would coordinate with these ministries in Indonesia. When we were doing our initial work, we, as I mentioned, did coordinate with the other agencies, and we plan on continuing our outreach to relevant stakeholders as we move forward with our next version.
Thank you, Carson. We still have many questions for our participants. Now I'm back to the Q&A chat, not from the screen, but in the Q&A chat. I will read the question from our participant in chat. This is from Bram Hertasning, Mr. Bram. He is a Deputy Director of Land Traffic, the Greater Jakarta Transportation Authority. His question is there any correlation between parking policy and greenhouse gas emission estimator? How United States implemented that, and in your opinion, what Indonesia should do to implement such policy? Thank you, from Mr. Bram as Deputy Director of Greater Jakarta Transport Authority. Please, Carson.
Thank you very much for the question. Right now, our tool does not allow a user to consider policy changes. It does to the extent that you could go in and say, well, what if I want to do a light rail project? Okay, here's the emissions associated with the characteristics of that project. Okay, let's compare that to what if we don't put a light rail down this road and we put a bus route? And so you could compare that sort of policy decision. Specific to parking policy, it doesn't allow that. We have had some conversations about whether we might be able to factor in more policy leaning analysis in the estimator. In terms of my thoughts for Indonesia, my wife would say I'm bold, but I'm not that bold. I wouldn't want to tell you all. Let me ask about the policy question, or the rest of the team, if you have thoughts on that. Gina, I don't know if EarPat speaks to this or not.
Yeah, I was just going to say there are other tools that Federal Highway is the Department of Transportation through other modal agencies are supporting to look at those type of policy or greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies. So looking at different parking demand management strategies. But this tool was not designed or intended for that. So we do not look at that in this tool.
And I would also add, and agree with what Carson and Gina are saying, that most time we look at the transit aspect of the project, and we are not really involved with the parking issues itself, as it is mostly MPO, which is Metropolitan Organization, their issue. But there are tools out there, for example, EPA and others, they may have tools that they consider. And those are some of the things they can probably look into deeply, because for those tools, you would need really technical analysis, technical expert to just make sure that it works for you.
Thank you. I will read again from the Q&A box, chat box, from Daud Joseph. Actually, he was my colleague. He was my friend. He is my friend. He was the director of Transjakarta, BRT Transjakarta. Now he is in Phoenix, US, Carson and Gina. His question is very interesting that the US has e-grid, zoning link to the calculation of displaced emission by the electrification of mass transportation. Jakarta's BRT is about to operate a certain number of electric buses. Is is it mandatory for Indonesia to have similar e-grid zoning to accurately measure the displaced emission? What are the alternative of calculation method? Thank you for Daud Joseph.
Thanks for the question. It is not required for Indonesia to have an equivalent to the e-grid. As I mentioned, we also give users the option to use the US mix, which is kind of an average composite emissions rate for electricity across the entire US. You could do something similar for Indonesia and just use a nationwide estimate. I know Indonesia is a very big country, and I don't know if there are differences in the environmental characteristics of electricity across that very geographically expansive expanse. But you don't need to have region specific. It just gives users more flexibility if you do.
Yeah, and I would just add is if there are vast differences, then it could the accuracy, I guess, maybe off in some locations. In some locations, if you're using an average, it could make the project seem like it has more emissions than it would, and vice versa. In the United States, we have some parts of the country that have 100% hydroelectricity, so they have no emissions, and other parts of the country are very heavily have coal as a primary electricity mix. So those are very different. So we wanted to give people the option, or since we had that level of data, to really get to that level. But again, I don't think it's, you could do it on a national average, but it would just be, you would just want to know, that may not be as accurate for some regions as others.
Thank you. Now there is a question from Riftayosi Nursatyo Sujoko from Q&A box. Is there a policy in United States in general and Washington DC in particular regarding the age limits of vehicles that may operate on the road? What is the policy, and whether the policies that have been implemented are sufficient to have an effect both in quality and quantity on the decrease in the value of our air pollution due to vehicle emission? Thanks. From Riftayosi. Carlson and Gina, please.
Yeah, I'm afraid this is outside my area of expertise. I don't know that there is an age limit on retiring vehicles. Maybe Sadat, Megan, or I will say that when we were doing the programmatic assessment, there is an FTA circular that sort of generally says the expected life of a transit project is 50 years, and that's why we started to include that amortization component in construction. We kind of spread it over a 50-year time period in that programmatic assessment, but I don't know if there's any policy on vehicle age.
Okay, thank you, Carson. Now we still have the question.
Sorry.
Yeah, we still have the question from Ms. Jusnita Merawati from Greater Jakarta Transportation Authority. I found it in chat box. When estimating the GHG emission for a broad range of proposed transit project, only the amount fit into the location or state will be accounted for. For the condition where it involves retrofit or capacity added to the project, how should the surplus be measured? Maybe this is the first question from Ms. Junita. Carson, do you have any idea?
So if I heard the question right, it sounds like the question is asking whether there's added capacity to an existing project. You could certainly use our tool to do that. A couple of ways. One way that I could envision, you could run a scenario like Gina walked through during the demonstration for the existing situation, and then run a second scenario where you're changing the inputs to reflect the added capacity, and then you could see what the excess or increased, maybe you're displacing more emissions, what the decrease in GHGs is.
Yeah, and I would say you could run the tool on, so you put the inputs in for construction just for the part you're adding. And then you could say the displaced emissions over the entire project if you want to look at that project, how it's adding to that service as a whole. So you could use the tool in a couple different ways for the different phases. If you wanted to look at just, the new part for the construction phase and the whole thing for the operations phase, the tool allows you to have that flexibility.
And
Thank you. Sadat, please.
Yeah, I agree with Gina, what she's saying. And one of the reasons the tool is so simple and you don't need the technical analysis is for people, for ordinary person or decision maker to understand if the project, if you can look at the system-wide approach and see if your project makes sense. If you're adding a project, it can displace, can it give you the results that you envision, or is it worth the investment that you're making? And those are the things, that you can use the tool for and make, your decision based on that information.
Thank you. We still have many questions so far, but unfortunately, due to the time constraint, this will be the end of Q&A sessions. We apologize for other questions that are not read and answered by our experts from USDOT. Sadat, Karsan, and Gina, is there any statement before we close the Q&A?
Hananto, I would just say, echo what Megan said at the beginning. Thank you for reaching out earlier this year about the estimator generally. Thank you for organizing this knowledge sharing session. It was fun for us to prepare. Yeah, I've appreciated the opportunity to share the work that the four of us, and there's a bigger team even, that we worked on so hard. Sadat, Megan, Gina. Anything else?
Just echoing what Carson said, thank you so much for reaching out. And I know there were questions that haven't been addressed, but we can try and address those if, Hananto, if you want to send those to us in a Word document or some other way, so we can try and get everyone their answers.
Thank you. Okay, the next sessions will be the certificate delivery. We humbly present the certificate to all of our speakers, our guests from USDOT. Of course, right now we will present it virtually. Please committee the first certificate for our director, Megan Blum. Yes. Megan, this is the certificate from Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. Thank you so much for your coming, for assisting us during this event. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm touched.
Yeah, thank you. The second certificate will be for Sadat. Sadat, this is the certificate from our minister to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, and we really appreciate the opportunity, like Carson and Gina and Megan has said. I hope this tool can bring you the result that you guys are looking for, and will help you to not reinvent the wheel, as we say in America. You can use our tool and modify it according to your need.
Thank you, Sadat. Thank you. The next certificate will be for Carson. Yes, this is for you, Carson, from Ministry of Transportation of Indonesia. Thank you for assisting us during this event.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
The last certificate will be for Gina. Gina, this is your certificate. Thank you for your coming and your assistance during this event. Thank you, Gina.
Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, we have come to the end of our webinar, Knowledge Sharing on Greenhouse Gas Emission Estimator Concept and Utilization. From our colleges, United States Department of Transportation, we have four here, Megan, Sadat, Carson, and Gina. Before I close this webinar, allow me to give a general statement. So taking climate action is an important key to save our planet. Public transport infrastructure investment is important, but don't forget with calculating or estimating the greenhouse gas emission from this sector. This can guide and lead us to understand how efficient and how clean our infrastructure to the environment. Indonesia is a vital partner in Indo-Pacific region for United States, and United States-Indonesia relations have taken on increasing importance. Megan, Sadat, Carson, and Gina, thank you very much for your kind assistance. We really appreciate your knowledge sharing on Ghg Estimator. We hope that you are still available for us to assist us in the future, notably for enhancing transportation sector in Indonesia. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to express gratitude to all of our speakers for today and also all of our participants. Thank you. See you later. Stay safe, stay healthy, and God bless us all. Let's give applause to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ananto. Pak Heru.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Carson, Gina, all speakers. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih.
Very useful for Indonesia. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih Mas Ananto.
Mas Ananto.
Luar
biasa. Ya,
Megan,
terus ya, Mas
Megan.
Ananto.
Thank you so much.
Ananto jam 9 pagi Cynthia.
Iya, Pak Karo.
Mbak Dina, terima kasih Mbak Dina.
Pak Karo.
Mas Heru, terima kasih Pak Kapus. Pak Junaidi,
Iya, iya.
Mas Maiti.
Ya, terus ya, Mas Ananto.
Siap, Pak Kapus. Pak Kapus, Pak Karo. Kami izin pamit, Pak.
Oh, enggak. Matur nuwun banget Mas Ananto. Sukses selalu,
Oke,
sukses.
makasih.
Matur nuwun, terima kasih.
Mohon izin Bapak Ibu semuanya.
Sekalian.
Terima kasih Mas Ananto.
Ya, Pak Kapus, mohon izin ya, Pak. Pak
Ya,
Dodi,
monggo.
semuanya,
Matur
izin
nuwun,
semuanya.
matur nuwun. Selamat bekerja Mas Ananto.
Pak Kapus.
Matur nuwun, makasih teman-teman. Pak Jun, Pak Karo,
Pak Junaidi, Pak Kapus.
dihadiri
Baik,
luar
terima
biasa.
kasih Pak.
Oke, thank you very much.
Ya, welcome sir.
Iya, Pak Karo, yes, luar biasa. Oke, matur nuwun.
Oke, makasih.
Thank you lah, matur nuwun. Mas Koko dan tim, matur nuwun, Mas Dodi, Mbak Dina.
Ya, baik Pak.
Matur nuwun. Nanti kalau ada apa resume, kalau ada resume nanti untuk laporan ke Pak Sekjen ya.
Sudah disiapkan Pak, insya Allah.
Thank you, nggih. Terima kasih. Terima kasih Mas Koko dan teman-teman dan tim luar biasa. Matur nuwun. Pustikom, saya ucap terima kasih.
Mas Yuda, terima kasih Mas Yuda.
Terima kasih
Ya.
Bapak, sama-sama. Pak
Ya,
Kapus.
Mas Danu, Mas
Terima kasih,
Rangga,
Mas
luar
Tikom,
biasa.
mantap.
Salam Pak Kapus, Tikom. Kapten
Siap,
Api,
Bapak.
ya. Matur nuwun. Saya mohon izin nggih, matur nuwun. Terima kasih semua, luar biasa. Nggih.